Good morning, good afternoon, and for some of you, good evening, and welcome to another in a series of AGIF sustainability webinars in 2021. My name is Eric Lynch, and I'm the CEO of the Asian Golf Industry Federation, and I'll be your host and facilitator for today's webinar. By way of background, the AGIF launched this series of webinars in the late 2020 and ran 10 online seminars in the latter part of last year. The feedback and participation from the global industry was fantastic and gratifying to receive. And as such, webinars will now become a mainstay in our activities now and post-COVID period. Most every week on Thursdays, we will continue to deliver webinars on the turf and club management education series with industry leaders to supply career building information to professionals in Asia and the rest of the world. We have a great lineup of speakers generously willing to share their time and experience with us, and we're very fortunate for that. A bit about the AGIF. The Asian Golf Industry Federation is a not-for-profit membership federation comprising of suppliers and facilities in the turf, club, and sports industry. The federation focuses on building sustainable practices both in the environmental and economic aspects throughout the Asia-Pacific region. We believe that key in the development of sustainable industry is the education and empowerment of professionals in the industry, and hence running events like today's. We've developed the AGIF certificate in greenskeeping, which is supported by the RNA and 5 AGIF member organizations. The CIG focuses on development of the skill set and greenskeeper turf professionals throughout Asia. It is in partnership with the New Zealand Sports Turf Institute as our education partner, and Alex is an employee of that federation. We also focus on club management education, our partner in the Club Management Association of America. We rolled out education in Asia for the pathway to the certified club manager degree. The CCCM is considered the gold standard in club management industry globally, and managers in Asia can achieve the necessary education here in Asia as a result of this partnership with the CMAA. It is vital to have strong partners in implementing education throughout Asia. And our education is recognized for credits by the PGA of America, the PGA of GBN Ireland, the PGA of Australia, the PGA of Japan, the Club Management Association of America, and the GCSAA. Due to travel restrictions from the COVID-19 pandemic, webinars are the only way we can continue to deliver education at the moment, and we'll resume event education when travel restrictions ease, and we'll keep you posted as this develops. Over the last few months, we have spent a lot of time improving our digital offering and membership benefits. For more information, please log on to www.agif.asia, as well as our LinkedIn and Facebook company pages. Please also sign up for our weekly newsletter to join the over 10,000 industry contacts in receiving weekly industry updates. The AGIF is a not-for-profit federation, and now more than ever, we rely upon membership dues to operate. So if you like what we do, or you think that your facility or company will benefit from communicating with the industry, please note that our membership benefits are substantial and can be seen on the website under AGIF membership benefits. Please take a look. And if you're already an AGIF member, thank you. Your ongoing support is greatly appreciated. And speaking of member support, we'd like to thank the sponsors of today's webinar, Sustain, Natural Fertilizers, and the Toro Company. Without their support, we would not be able to run events like this, so we thank them for their ongoing patronage. On to some housekeeping issues. Our speaker today, Alex Glasgow, will present for roughly 50 to 60 minutes, and we'll have 30 minutes after that for a Q&A. The chat and Q&A buttons are on throughout, so please feel free to ask questions, which we can then voice to Alex during the Q&A. There are also a few survey questions, as I mentioned, and for you to answer as well. The survey is now open, so please take time to answer the brief questions. Now on to the main event. I'd like to welcome Mr. Alex Glasgow. Alex is the New Zealand Sports Turf Institute Technical Director on Agronomy, a role that he has held since 2010. In this capacity, he is responsible for the overall development and management of agronomic services provided by the NZSTI. Alex is also a member of the Executive Committee of the Sports Turf Association of New Zealand. Alex has been involved in a wide range of sports turf construction and maintenance projects throughout New Zealand and the Asia Pacific region. His specialist areas include sports field design, construction and maintenance, environmental and sustainable issues related to sports turf, golf course construction and maintenance, golf course design and horse racing tracks, Alex is also the technical editor of the Turf Magazine Management Journal, an industry-leading technical publication. Today, Alex will be talking about soil tissue testing and fertilizer planning. Alex, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and yes, it's good to be here. Hopefully, I can provide something interesting and thought-provoking for you. Just reference to my background, I think it's wishful thinking. Hopefully, one day soon we'll be able to travel again soon. So I'll just I'm going to do a presentation, so I'll just share my screen and get this up. Okay, I'll just. Okay, so the subject of my talk is soil and tissue testing, as you know, as it relates to, well, obviously in relation to turf management, and how you then use that for in terms of in relation to fertiliser planning. I won't really get on to much about fertiliser planning. I want to talk about soil and tissue testing, try to increase your knowledge on it, and give you sort of, empower you more to understand tissue testing and soil testing, because my observation would be that a lot of people in New Zealand don't really understand much about soil tests, but they do quite a lot of it. So try to enlighten you some in relation to that. Okay, so today what I'm going to cover is soil testing methods, what the options are that you have. There's a number of them. Soil testing and soil test interpretation, what is it, and what options do you have? Also, I want to ask the question, how relevant is soil testing in a high sand, low CEC situation, which is, you know, the kind of situation a lot of turf management, putting greens and stadium fields and so on is involved in. I would tend to question whether it is the best method to determine nutrient status, and that there are other options. And in particular, I'm talking here about sort of leaf tissue testing. I'll talk about what it is, and ask the question of whether it's a better option for turf managers in relation to fertility management. Okay, so I'll start off with soil testing and what it is. Soil testing, it's a chemical analysis of the soil to determine how much plant available nutrient is present. Now, this is a really important point, because the aim of a soil test extraction method is to mimic as much as possible what it is that the plant can take out of the soil. It doesn't extract everything, because with all nutrients, there'll be a whole lot more there that the plant can't get that's not plant available. So a key point to note is that it's a chemical analysis of the soil to determine how much plant available nutrient is present. Now, that's also in theory, because these things are not entirely straightforward, as much as we all probably tend to think they are. It's not as precise as you might think, and I think that's another thing that people need to understand. I tend to describe it as sort of slightly rough science, but anyway. There are different soil testing methods that they extract different amounts of nutrients. So they're all endeavouring to do the same thing, but they don't always come up with the same result. So as an example, for phosphorus, you've got the Olsen extraction, the Bray extraction, Malich is just an example of some. And, you know, this might beg the question, which is best? It's not a discussion I want to get into. It's a thing that some people do worry greatly about, which is the best extraction method for my situation, but I wouldn't be too worried about it, and I'm certainly not going to discuss, you know, what I think is the best or otherwise. It tends to be quite situational. It depends a little bit on soil type and climate and things like that. Okay, so then I'll talk about soil test interpretation, which is about turning the numbers into practical actions. To do that, you need to know the targets you want to achieve. You know, what levels of soil fertility level do you want to achieve, and how to convert things like milliequivalents per 100 grams, or parts per million, or milligrams per litre and so on. These are the sort of things that you'll see on soil test results. How to convert them into kilograms per hectare, which I would sort of describe as the kind of language of fertiliser applications. You very hard to say I've got X milligrams per 100 grams of nutrient that equals such and such kilograms per hectare, because that's what you need to do, is to get into a form like kilograms per hectare, which you can relate to actual amounts of nutrient that you're going to put on. Just check that. Okay, so and then I'll talk about these things here that you may well be familiar with, things like SLAN, MLSN, and BCSR, which are methods of soil test interpretation, which is how you make sense of the numbers, basically. Okay, so what I've got here is, this is part of trying to explain aspects of soil testing to you. I've got a soil test result here. There's no interpretation shown here. This is just a couple of samples. There's one there, and that's another soil sample there. So each one of these columns is a result of a soil test. And I just wanted to explain some of the things on here so that you understand perhaps a little better what's going on. In this case, there's been a couple or three extractions of nutrient done, and I'll explain that as I go through here. But the first thing to note is pH. You can see here, interestingly, there's two pH results. The top one's a water extraction, and the second one down is a calcium chloride extraction. We don't normally do that, but this was requested in this case. And the thing to note there is that we've got two different methods of pH testing, and we've got two quite different results. So once again, coming back to the concept of how accurate is soil testing, when you start to do different soil tests, different methods and so forth, you'll find that you get numbers that are all over the place, which can obviously be confusing. But it's just the reality of it. It's wrong to assume that it's incredibly accurate, because what we're trying to do is estimate plant available nutrient across a whole wide range of soil types, plant types, climates, and so forth. And it's not that easy to get it bang on. Okay, so next thing here, just the Olsen P, and just those units there, milligrams per litre. You'll tend to see quite a lot of different units on soil test results. And just for your information, milligrams per litre is parts per million. And I'll talk more about parts per million because it's it kind of leads us more to that sort of kilograms per hectare type of thing. So it's a little bit more easy to understand when you start to realise it's milligrams per litre equals parts per million. But I just wanted to point that out, that milligrams per litre, that's parts per million. Okay, the next thing here, you'll see we've got three numbers for each of these nutrients: potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sodium. So you're thinking, okay, well, have we done three soil test extractions here to get three different numbers? And the answer to that is no. These numbers here are all arrived at from one extraction, one chemical analysis of the soil. But what then happens is they get a number, and then they do some maths on it to convert it into these different forms. And in this case, you can see we've got three forms: milliequivalents per 100 grams, percentage BS or percentage base saturation. Those are things that a lot of you will be familiar with, I assume, so I will talk about those. And then math units, that's an old New Zealand thing that they report on soil tests. They calculate the math units, but we don't look at those. So we haven't had three tests done here on this soil. We've had one test, and they've done some interconversions to express the results in different units. The next thing down here, sometimes the levels of nutrient are so low that they can't actually get a meaningful result for, in this case, expressing it in terms of milliequivalents per 100 grams. So that's what that less than 0.5 means, basically undetectable or undeterminable. So I mean, in that case, it's very low. I'll come on to talking about things like CUC later. I'll talk about here, this one here, volume weight. I'll refer to this later when I talk about some calculations that get done, but it's just a useful thing to be aware of. it's basically telling you it's a grams per mil. Grams weight per unit of volume. It's like essentially like a density measurement, but it tells you about the result of this tells you a bit about the soil type. In this case, it's a sand. If you see a volume weight on a soil test result up around 1.35, you can be pretty sure that it's a sand, because that's where sands tend to sit in terms of this number. Good soils might be, good mineral soils, they might be 0.85 to 1, so they're just not as dense. Okay, so then finally down here, we've got a whole lot more numbers. Now these are a different extraction. These ones up here were done with an ammonium acetate extraction, and this one down here is done with Malich 3 extraction. Now this was just requested by a client to have it done in a couple of ways. Okay, so the thing to note here, different extraction, Malich 3, you can see the units are the same, milligrams per litre, so parts per million. But the interesting thing about this is the difference in the results. Bear in mind here, the test is trying to measure the same thing, which is the plant available nutrient. But the Olsen P extraction says there's 13 ppm. The Malich one says there's 56 ppm. So there are quite big differences in what soil test results actually say. So once again, you need to bear this in mind. These differences can be quite large. Okay, so talking here about soil test units, just to help make some sense of these things. On a weight basis, what's that? Micrograms per gram, milligrams per kilogram, grams per tonne. They're all parts per million. Volume basis, micrograms per mil, milligrams per litre, grams per metre cube. Once again, they're all parts per million. So a lot of the time, these things might be expressed in different ways, but they all mean the same thing. And I think it can be quite confusing, but if you realise a lot of the time they are just ppm, it makes life a little bit simpler. So what about this one here, this milli equivalents per 100 gram? It's a number that, a form of result that I'm sure some people will be familiar with. You can use a formula here. Once again, it's slightly, not extremely accurate, but it's reasonably accurate to work out, to convert this to ppm. So if you've got a milli equivalents per 100 gram result, to convert it to ppm, you take your milli equivalents per 100 grams and you multiply it by a constant. And the constant is different for each nutrient. And you can see them there, 391 for K, 200 for calcium, 122 for magnesium. And this constant is based on the atomic weight of the element and the charge on it. I don't want to go any further than that. It's just suffice to say that you can use this calculation to determine the amount present in ppm, parts per million. Okay, so talking about parts per million, what does this actually mean? So we have a result from a test. P in a soil test result equals 22 milligrams per litre, which equals 22 parts per million. So to put it into something that you can perhaps recognise or understand more readily, if you have, in that situation, 1 million kilograms of soil, there is going to be 22 kilograms of plant available phosphorus present, 22 parts per million. So that's what it means. So hopefully you can sort of picture that more readily than 22 milligrams per litre. 22 ppm, 22 kilograms of phosphorus per million kilograms of soil. Now, once again, keep referring back to this. This is plant available, or estimation of plant available. There will be more than that, but a lot of it won't be plant available. Okay, so just to find a little bit in this picture, how much is 1 million kilograms of soil? Okay, so if we think about that, what we are here is interested in the surface layer. And the question is, well, how much does that weigh? So why are we interested in the surface layer? Well, that's because that's the part that we're going to fertilise. That's where we want to alter the fertility. It's where the roots of the plant are likely to be, and it's also the place that we have information about. We do a soil test from there, so that's where we know what the fertility is, because that's where we did the soil test from. So on a per hectare basis, how much does how much is how does 1 million kilograms of soil work out? Okay, on a per hectare basis. So the weight of the soil is the volume of the soil times the volume weight. And remember the volume weight, that's that number off the soil test result. So the volume of our soil is 10,000. That's 10,000 square meters. That's the hectare. Now, in this case, we're saying 0.75, which is 75 millimeters. Now, I'm not sure, I'm assuming it's the case everywhere, or fairly universally. What we always recommend is the soil testing depth for turf should be 75 millimeters. Typically, that's reflecting root depth, and also, realistically, what you're going to affect with your fertiliser applications. So our volume is area times depth, so 10,000 square meters times 0.75 meters, or 75 millimeters. We've got 750 meters cubed is our volume that we're interested in. And the weight of that is the volume of the soil times the volume of weight, which is, in this case, 750 times 1.35. That's off the soil test result. So that's 1,013 tonnes, which is pretty much what it is, 1,013,000 kilograms. So let's just call it 1 million in round numbers. So if you think about it, like in this sense, this is quite a convenient sort of a thing. If we look at a sand soil that's got a volume weight of about 1.35, and we're looking at a 75 millimeter thick layer, which is what we soil test, that weighs about 1 million kilograms. So you can then say, well, if I've got ppm results on my soil test, I can interpret them roughly as being kilograms. So I can say, well, if I've got a 22 ppm phosphorus result, that basically means about 22 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare in that layer. So that's just trying to, once again, take those numbers, which can appear very confusing with the units, and try to make them more real or recognisable. Okay, so I will talk here about some aspects of soil test results, things you may or may not be familiar with. This is a soil test result from a lab here in New Zealand, but I think the fundamental formats should be reasonably, people be sort of fairly familiar with this sort of thing. Okay, so I just want to talk about the things that we're typically testing for in a soil test. pH up the top there, then phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Those are macronutrients. Those are essential plant macronutrients. Sodium's also tested here. It's not a not a plant essential nutrient generally, but possibly for some warm season grasses, but generally not regarded as such. Not regarded as a plant, an essential plant nutrient, but it's tested for. What else we got here? CEC, I'll talk more about that. I've talked about the volume, and I'll talk a bit more about nitrogen as well. But so this soil test here is testing mainly these 4 macronutrients: phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of soil testing does boil down to that, as simple as that. Just one thing to note here, that these results are expressed in 2 ways: milliequivalents per 100 grams, percentage BS. There hasn't been 2 extractions done here. They've just been presented in 2 different ways. I've taken the result, did the maths on it, and presented them in 2 different ways. Okay, so another thing, this histogram here is a lab thing to help you interpret it, so you can get a bit of a picture of what's your result means. Now, what I think you need to be aware of is that well, a lot of people, when they see a low number, they think, oh my God, I've got problems there, I need to really increase it. But the soil scientists, how they would tend to interpret low would mean that it's possible that you will get a response if you apply the nutrient. They're not saying definitely, they're just saying it's possible. So if it's rated as low, it's possible you get a response. The interpretation of medium would be, if you apply more of that nutrient, it's unlikely that you'll get a response from that nutrient. And obviously, by definition, high is going to mean that as well. So but I think a lot of people would interpret it as meaning, if it's low, I apply it, I'll get a benefit. That's not strictly what it means at all from a soil scientist point of view. It's much more, if it's low, if you apply it, you may get a response. Okay, so another thing here to be aware of, in some labs, I'm not sure, certainly it's the case here, you will be asked sample type. And what they're really asking you for here is what is the grass species that's been grown. And this is of relevance because they have different medium ranges here for the different grass species. So if you put the right grass species, the one you're growing, the medium range will be relevant. It doesn't change the extraction or what's in the soil at all. It just means that this interpretation graph here is more relevant to you. So just be aware of that. If they're asking for the sample type, put the right species, because that way this becomes more meaningful to you. Okay, so the other thing here is the origin of this medium range. Now, I think what a lot of people will assume is that there's been an awful lot of research going on, all sorts of university trials and pot trials and so on to work out, exactly what the ideal nutrient level is for each specific grass and each specific situation. And the truth is that's not the case at all. A lot of the time, there's not really a hell of a lot of information about exactly what is the right level. So, how do they arrive at these ranges? The way that they arrive at these medium ranges, this range here, is that this lab gets a lot of soil test results in, and if they get ones for, say, let's say it's for ryegrass, all of the ryegrass ones they put into their database, and then they just define their medium range is out of the database. They work out the average and then probably do something like a standard deviation either side of it and call that the medium range. It's a useful approximation, but it's not the same as in-depth research to work out exactly what's ideal or perfect for that particular grass. So the medium range, bear in mind this medium range, it's useful, but it's just been generated from their database basically. Okay, so just talking here about soil testing for nitrogen. Sort of traditionally in New Zealand, we have tested for phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium in soil tests, which is kind of strange in many ways because it probably comes out of agriculture, but I've always thought it's strange from a turf management point of view because the most important nutrient in turf management by far is nitrogen. And yet traditionally in turf management and in agriculture, we haven't tested for it, which seems really quite odd. And it does mean that people kind of maybe become fixated on these nutrients when actually they should be paying even more attention to nitrogen. So we have started to use this nitrogen testing a lot more. We can do it's an extra cost, but we can get the nitrogen tested as part of the overall test, and it's useful. How is it useful, or how does it work? What you need to know is that over the course of a 12-month period, in any root zone, some nitrogen will be supplied by the root zone, because you've got a nitrogen store in the form of organic matter, and as the organic matter breaks down, it releases nitrogen plus other nutrients. But it's actually quite a potentially very significant source of nitrogen over the course of a 12-month period. So in addition to that, you need to fertilise to sort of top up or make up the deficiencies when there's not enough nitrogen in the root zone. You need to apply more nitrogen to make sure you can grow enough grass and so forth. So that's where this information is useful, is when we are trying to work out for any specific turf what we think the annual nitrogen requirement will be for fertiliser, which is the basis of the fertiliser program. It should always be the basis of the fertiliser program. How much nitrogen is required annually? So when we're working that out, knowing this number here is very useful because it gives us a really strong indication of how much nitrogen is likely to be supplied into the system just from the root zone itself. Now, when you get into really sandy soils, this is going to be way low. There's not a lot of organic matter, and hence not a lot of nitrogen sort of cycles into the root zone that way. So just to sort of summarise that, nitrogen testing can be done. Didn't used to be a major thing, but we would tend to do it often these days. Okay, so I'll talk here about cation exchange capacity. Basically, what is important to know here is that soil particles can have negative or do have negative charges on them, and those negative charges attract and hold positively charged cations. The cations being things like, well, in this case, the ones we're interested in, calcium, potassium, magnesium in particular. So the negative charges in the soil attract and hold the positively charged cations. So the CEC is essentially a measure of the amount of negative charges present in the soil. It doesn't tell you how much nutrients there, it tells you how many negative charges are present. So the analogy I like to use, it's like it tells you the size of the petrol tank. You know, obviously, the bigger the petrol tank, if you want, the more negative charges, the more nutrient it can hold. The smaller the petrol tank, the less negative charges, the less nutrient it can hold. So knowing the size of the petrol tank doesn't tell you how much petrol you've got in it. It just tells you how much it could hold. So it's just like the petrol tank itself. You know, the bit of information you need is the indicator gauge telling you where it sits, how much petrol there is in it. And in this case, the equivalent is the percentage saturation, which we call also the percentage BS. So when you get results in this form, if it says 5%, what it's basically telling you is that 5% of the negative charges, 5% of the CEC are occupied by that particular nutrient. Okay, so it's think about it, that petrol tank thing and the petrol tank gauge, that sort of thing. And the key thing to know here, and I guess a lot of people will be aware of this, is that sands, which we tend to be dealing with in turf a lot of the time, they are low CEC soils. They don't have a very big petrol tank. Okay, so I want to talk about interpretation here. So soil test interpretation, BCSR, this is where the CEC thing will become hopefully apparent. BCSR means base cation saturation ratios. The basic cations are these ones: potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sodium. So when you see results expressed in this percentage BS way, that's when you're using this method of interpretation to make sense of your soil test results. The merely equivalent ones are still listed down here, but in this case, we're looking at the percentage BS results. Okay, so soil test interpretation using the BCSR approach. This is based on the idea that nutrients should be present at minimum percentage saturation levels and in ideal ratios. So as an example, typically what a typical recommendation under this regime would be that percentage saturation of potassium should be between 5 and 10%. And further to that, for it to be in an ideal ratio with magnesium, magnesium should be twice the potassium level, meaning that if we had 5% potassium, we should have 10% magnesium. So that gives us the ideal ratio and the correct minimum percentage saturation of potassium, and then magnesium is generated from that. Okay, so what I would say about this method of soil test interpretation is that it's really good for selling fertilizers. It has been popular and is popular, and I think one of the main reasons for that is because it is good at selling fertilizers. And just using an agricultural example here to illustrate this, and if we were on this farm here and we've got a CEC of 25 and 150 millimeters of root depth, and we decided we wanted to target 5% of the exchange sites filled with potassium under our BCSR approach. Okay, if I work that out, I'm going to calculate that to achieve that, I need to have 733 kilograms of potassium per hectare present. Now, if I do that same interpretation and calculation using the way I would do it, which is the next method I'll talk about, where I'm not interested in minimum saturation levels, I'm just interested in enough nutrient being present. If I do that, I calculate 160 kgs per hectare of potassium is enough. So you can see that if you're a big believer in the base cation saturation ratio, you're going to be buying a whole lot more potassium than if you interpret it the other way. Now, I used to be quite into this method of interpretation of soil tests, but I have to say I'm not anymore. I don't really understand it exactly, but it seems to have some sort of mystical appeal. And I think what it is that when you're kind of at the pointy end of turf management, you know, golf greens and the likes, it's not necessarily easy. You often have a lot of problems with disease and so forth. So you're kind of thinking there must be a secret that I haven't quite cottoned on to. And if only I could find that secret, all of my problems would disappear. And I think that's why this has appeal. It's this idea of trying to achieve these perfect ratios. And if you get the perfect ratios, which believe me is very difficult to do, everything will be perfect. It doesn't work like that. But I have seen people become really fixated on it, and they spend an awful lot of time and effort in pursuit of the perfect ratio. So yeah, I would just say I don't believe in it particularly, and I certainly don't recommend trying to spend heaps of time trying to get the perfect ratios. Okay, so the next thing I'll talk about is the SLAN approach, which is sufficiency level of available nutrient. This simply aims to have sufficient nutrient present in the soil to meet the plant's requirements for growth. No minimum level of percentage saturation, just sufficient amounts of nutrient for growth. So we're not concerned about minimum saturation levels or ratios. And so basically, to put it in easy to understand terms, a minimum parts per million of nutrient present, or you know, converting that to a kilograms per hectare amount, you know, just sort of identifying what the minimum amounts required in the soil for the plant to be able to grow satisfactorily. Not worried about, like I say, minimum saturation levels and ratios and stuff like that. And so this here, just if you see the numbers in this form here, this milliequivalents per 100 grams, that's a form of you know, this SLAN approach. You know, that if you're using them, if you're looking at those numbers, you use and interpreting those numbers, you're looking at this sort of SLAN approach to interpreting soil tests. Okay, so here I've just got an example of some sort of target ranges that we have or use. These are what we would say, you know, if you're in that range, you know, you should have sufficient of the nutrient present. Now, how we arrive at these ranges is just through a database of soil tests. So we are always looking for, when we get soil tests, say from a very good ryegrass area, or for a very good creeping bentgrass area, or kikuyu area, or whatever, we'll put it into our database to see, you know, what range or where these levels sits. And particularly what we're always trying to do in this situation is evolve our levels, but in particular evolve them downwards, evolve the bottom of the range downwards. So, you know, if we get a really good ryegrass, we get a test from a really good ryegrass area, and we see that the potassium saturation, or not saturation, potassium level in terms of milliequivalents per 100 grams was 0.3, we would look at that and say, well, look, this thing got really good ryegrass at 0.3, so that would appear to suggest that that is not a limiting level for ryegrass. So we would always tending to evolve these ratings or these ranges, but evolve them downwards, because we're looking to find examples of plants growing well at low levels, because that's ultimately what we want to do, is to achieve good results in terms of turf management outcomes, but with as little nutrient as possible. So I've talked about that base cation saturation ratio and SLAN methods. Now, just to illustrate one of the points I was making before about what's better at selling fertilizers, in this case, we have got our milliequivalents per 100 grams. That's our sort of SLAN approach numbers on here, and got our histogram graph. And we've got our percentage BS ones on here, and we've got our histogram graphs. Now, if I'm looking at it from the SLAN approach, I'm looking at that and thinking, well, no problem, everything's in the medium range. I don't have anything to be worried about. If I'm looking at it from this point of view, I'm looking at it here, and this is the reaction that people will have. They'll say, well, look, I've got 2 nutrients there that are low, I need to apply them to get into the medium range because they're low, and I'm concerned about that. But the truth is the actual amount in the soil is exactly the same. It's the same soil, same extraction, just the results expressed in a different way. And so this to me is an example of how the base cation saturation ratio approach will always tend to recommend more fertiliser than this one up here. And we consider this to be a much more valid and environmentally sustainable approach. Okay, so soil test interpretation. Now this is a new, relatively new approach that you will hear about, this minimum level for sustainable nutrition. And I know it's a little bit more sophisticated than this, but I just tend to look at it from our point of view in terms of what we've always tended to do is fundamentally, I feel what it's endeavouring to do is to target the bottom of the range. It's trying to find how low can this number here be and still sustain healthy turf growth. And that to me is fundamentally what this approach to interpretation is doing. And that's certainly an approach that we've always tended to take. We're looking to find how low this number can be. And one of the things that almost always amazes me is just how low these numbers do appear to be able to be. And often where we assume they need to be is higher than in actuality. Okay, so I'll go on now and talk about tissue testing because I think it's something that we should use a lot more on turf because of the situation that we live in, which is very low CEC soils. The high reliance on soil testing, to me, it makes a lot of sense in agriculture, but I definitely question whether it's anything like as applicable in our turf situations, in particular in sand. In soil and turf, soil testing works well. My contention is that tissue testing is a much more of a precision-based approach to turf management, nutrition management, and sand-based and low CEC turf. Okay, so I'll try and put a little bit of perspective on this turf versus agriculture. Got our turf situation and our farm situation there. There's actually the same mountain there. I think that farm must be just up the road there a bit. Okay, so if we're in what was I going to say here? In just something about soil testing and agriculture in general. New Zealand is a very much an agricultural background or agricultural economy. So we have obviously a lot of soil testing in agriculture here, and it's served that industry extremely well. And I think it's not surprising then that there's a strong emphasis on it in turf in New Zealand, but it also seems all around the world there's a very strong emphasis on it in turf. And I know it's useful, but I think there's potentially better sort of ways. And I'll just talk a little bit here about the sort of differences. If I'm a cow farmer and I'm interested in potassium nutrition in my pasture, I'm just going back to that previous example. If I have that situation, 5% of the exchange sites are filled with potassium. There's that amount of potassium present, 733 kilograms of potassium per hectare, which is a lot. Now, if I come across to my golf green, CEC of 2, 75 millimetre root depth, 5% of the exchange sites filled with potassium. So kind of the equivalent situation, 5%, but different here. Now, in that case, there's only 40 kilograms of potassium per hectare present. Now, if you think about that in the context of annual fertiliser, it's quite likely that a whole lot more than 40 kilograms would be applied to that on an annual basis. So we're measuring really a small amount of our total potassium in the soil, and you have to argue, well, how relevant even is that? Whereas in the agricultural situation, if I do a soil test and I've got low potassium, what it tells me I can do is that I can then calculate that I can apply a large amount of potassium. It might be a couple of 100 kilograms, and that I know is able to be stored because the soil has the storage capacity for it, and the plant will be able to utilise it. And meaning that I can take a soil test maybe every 3 or 4 years, put then a large dose of potassium on and know that the job is done or taken care of for the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. So that's really useful in that situation. In turf, when the total amount of potassium measured in the soil is so little, you have to ask, well, really, is that information that useful? Just another example here, agriculture versus sort of sandy turf. If I am on a farm and I want to raise the pH because I've done a soil test that says I've got a low pH, well, if I just go back here, look at these two situations, once again, they're sort of somewhat similar in terms of both of these soils would be, if in this situation, if you had 75% of the exchange sites filled with calcium, the pH would be around 6.5. In the case of our turf, we would have 270 kilograms of calcium present per hectare. In the case of our agricultural situation, we'd have nearly 7,000 kilograms. So once again, if I take a soil test on a farm and I've got low pH, what I can then do is plan my lime applications over the next 3 or 4 years, high rates, maybe once or twice a year, knowing that if I do that, my pH will come up as I plan to do, as I want it to do. Problems kind of, you've planned out how you're going to deal with it, and you set up your fertiliser program for several years. So that's really useful. In the case of our soil, in our grass turf situation, in this situation where there's so little calcium present, I'd even be asking myself, well, how do I know I've even got enough calcium here for plant nutrition? And I would say, well, you don't. So the soil test is not necessarily that valuable. So maybe we need more information. Okay, so looking here again, getting back to this minimum level for sustainable nutrition and how low can you go? How do we know what is a sufficient or minimum level of nutrient in the soil? If we're looking at it from that point of view, what I would say is you need to observe what's happening. You need to know the soil test level. If you want to try to figure this out, you need to observe what's happening. And if you combine that with leaf and tissue testing, that can help you to confirm what's actually in the plant. But one of the things I'd say that's really important is your observation. Trust what you see and believe what you see. Because I often see this where you've got very low levels in the soil and low levels in the leaf, but the plant's doing perfectly well. You've got a healthy turf that's performing well. So that observation is really important. What you see is important. And in this relationship, in this situation, I'd use this analogy of keeping a water balance, which is kind of what I'd say soil testing is a bit like, versus using a moisture meter, which is more like tissue testing. So with a water balance, you record losses and gains in the system, and then you add them up, and over time, then you can say, well, this balance is telling me that in theory, there's X amount of water in the root zone. Okay, that's a bit like soil testing to me. What the soil testing does is you take a test and it says, well, in theory, there's this amount of nutrient available in the root zone, versus what I kind of prefer is going straight to the horse's mouth, so to speak. So if you use a moisture meter, rather than relying on your water balance that you calculated, you stick a moisture meter in the ground and it tells you actually exactly what's there. I think that's better information than the water balance. And the moisture meter to me is like an equivalent of the tissue test, because the tissue test tells you exactly what's in the plant, hence what the plant's been able to get out of the soil. So it's kind of more nuanced, more accurate information. Okay, so here talking about, this is just an example of a leaf tissue test result. This is for ryegrass. And you know, what you need to see here is various nutrients. There's these ones here that are present in the plant in bigger amounts, macronutrients essentially, in percentages. Then you come down here, these are parts per million. And one thing here, you're getting some micronutrients in this test as well as the macronutrients. And there's your results. This medium range, same as before. This will be based on a lot of ryegrass samples from pasture here in New Zealand. But that's the medium range that they're recommending based on analysis of their database. Okay, so just sort of bringing it together, I want to illustrate to you why you perhaps shouldn't be too reliant on soil testing, or how it can be a little bit suspect. in terms of the information it provides. So this is an example of our practice putting green at our office in Palmerston North. There's nothing wrong with this green. The soil test might suggest otherwise, but I can assure you the green's in good condition, it looks fine, it responds well, it grows well, it's good putting green. We did a soil test and a tissue test on it at the same time last year. And so that is the soil test result. And if you were to look at that on its own, with no other information, I think you'd be quite alarmed. You'd be saying, well, this green must look terrible, it can't be growing, it must be starving and in terrible condition. Because you can see, I mean, look at that, calcium's not even detectable. And then these other ones are really, really low. Okay, so you think, this is not good. But we also did a tissue test at the same time, and this is what we found. Nothing of concern in terms of nutrient levels in the plant. This seems to me that tissue testing is a more accurate method of analysis of nutrient status than soil test. Soil test here, trying to measure what's plant available. That's what it's setting out to do. Plant available here, what's in the plant, clearly the plant's not having a lot of difficulty getting nutrient despite what's up there. So that's one of the main points I wanted to make, is the difference or the sort of results you can get between when you compare soil and tissue test results. So here's another one, same sort of thing. It's a golf green, CEC of 3. In this case, we've got the milli equivalents. That's a SLAN interpretation. Percentage-based saturation, that's the BCSR interpretation. And then we've got our tissue test result. And okay, so according to our milli equivalents per 100 grams BCSR SLAN approach, we've got major problems here. According to this percentage BS, we've got problems. But according to our tissue test result, we don't have any particular problems except for the calcium. So we're kind of, obviously there's a bit of a red light there perhaps, we're worried about that. Certainly we'd look into that. But once again, the main thing here, our soil test results are saying we've got problems. Our tissue tests are saying, well, we haven't got problems, the plant's getting plenty of nutrient. And when we come to the calcium one, I'm skeptical about this. I don't think we've got a calcium problem here because I'm looking at these greens and this is them here. There's nothing wrong with these greens. So this is kind of testing this thing here. I mean, how low is too low? But the point being is that these greens, that was the results from these greens, or this particular green, and there's clearly no particular problem with the turf. The two different colours of grass here, it's brown top, and you've got different colonies of brown top. But when you looked at it, the green was in very good condition. So once again, coming back to that thing, trust your observations, believe your observations because they really are important. So this was a situation where, once again, soil testing versus tissue testing. To me, the tissue testing is telling a better, more truthful story or a more accurate story. Okay, so pretty much done here. I'll just wrap this up now. Just a couple more slides. So with tissue testing, we can find interpretation levels, and I can find numerous of these and sort of refine them to give you sort of recommended levels. But I think there's potential to be even more precise than this because every situation is different. Every climate and root zone and so forth is different. So there's potential to take these sort of levels and refine them more, and to be more accurate and more precise about how you're interpreting and making sense of these numbers. So what I'd be encouraging people to do if they're interested is to get into a tissue testing regime, but look to develop and refine your own interpretation levels based on the responses you see and other things that you observe. And just as a final example, so the sort of more precise approach that this allows you to do is this is an example of anthracnose and creeping bentgrass. And the research shows that if the potassium is less than 1.9% in the leaf, anthracnose is likely to be severe. If the potassium is in the 2.4 to 3% range, anthracnose will be minimised. And if nitrogen is above 3.35%, anthracnose will also be minimised. So the idea would be during your anthracnose season, you would tissue test and you would be making sure that you're hitting these targets here, because if you do that, you're going to minimize your susceptibility to that disease. And this is an approach that, say, people would take in horticulture, where they would be monitoring crops at key times, knowing that they need to achieve certain levels of nutrient in the leaf to get, I don't know, maximum fruit production or whatever it might be. And so I think we should look at doing more of this sort of thing in turf. It's like I say, it's a more precise approach. I think it's going to be more nuanced and more accurate than soil testing. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I hope that's been of some interest to you. And I will stop that sharing and I will put this back on. Okay.
All right. Alex, thank you so much. We've got some great questions on the Q&A. First, we have from Henry in Sarawak, Malaysia. He asks, do you recommend amending root zone mixture to desired CEC level at the pre-planting stage?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a good idea to increase the CEC because it will increase your nutrient retention. And in your circumstances of Sarawak, you have a real problem with high rainfall, a very high rainfall. And so leaching of nutrient from root zones is a big problem. So yes, it's certainly a good idea, and especially in a climate like that with a very very high rainfall. And it's as I understand it, it's a very linear relationship. So like if you've got if you take an example of having a CEC of 2 versus a CEC of 20, basically in a situation of a CEC of 20, it can hold 10 times as much of those cations than the CEC of 2 can. And that'll make a big difference. And it's one of the reasons why sands are regarded as being hungry. They don't hold a lot of nutrient. And yeah, so definitely I think in some circumstances it's a good idea, no question.
Thanks, Alex. We have a question also from Kirk in Vancouver. Travels out here quite a bit to Asia as well. How often do you recommend courses to run tissue tests? Ease and access to tissue testing in the region has been expensive and limited in the past. Has that improved over the last 5 years or so?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I've kind of reflected on this. I do wonder why we haven't sort of got into tissue testing more, because I just think it's so applicable to turf. And I think one of the reasons is because we're sort of been very agriculturally driven here in New Zealand, but also, yeah, it's been kind of expensive. Like a soil test would be cheaper than a tissue test. Pretty much traditionally, I guess a tissue test would be twice as expensive. And if you take the attitude that you only have to tissue, if you soil test it, it'll see you right for 12 months, the information will be good for 12 months, I suppose you could say, well, that's quite reasonably inexpensive. But another thing though that people do, I see, is when they do soil test, they might test all 18 greens on a golf course when they're all pretty much exactly the same, and they really don't need to test them all. So they can often end up spending a lot of money on soil testing, which would probably be better deployed into tissue testing. So what I would recommend, if you get into this, what we recommend is I'd be looking at monthly, and just go once a month. Think about it in terms of practicality. You mow your greens, you get the clippings in the catcher, you get a really good sample collection essentially across a large number of the greens. So once a month, grab some clippings out of the catcher and send them away. And that to me is not that expensive, and it's probably equivalent expense to say testing 18 greens once a year to do one tissue test monthly. That's what we recommend if you're really looking to use this to the fullest advantage. And I think it has got cheaper. There's no question that the cost of tissue testing has tended to come down. So I think that's another thing that's beneficial or sort of helpful at this point.
That has been a challenge, the cost of soil testing. So it's good to hear that there's progress being made. We have a question from Ubendra from India. great session. As you suggested to go for tissue testing, how do you do the testing? Meaning we have to take a sample from mowed grass clippings, etc. So some elementary information.
Yeah, we could get into. I think you can get into discussions about this, but the truth is, you're not going to. If you look at how you do it on a ryegrass pasture, you go out there with a plastic bag and scissors. It's really easy, but clearly you can't do that on turf. The only way you can do it on putting greens is by getting the clippings out of the catcher. Now, like I say, there's some people might argue around iron filings and stuff like that, but I just think that's by the by. Fundamentally, we're kind of set up well for it in fine turf because we're going out and collecting a good sample, cross-section sample on a regular basis. So yeah, that's what I recommend for areas that are mowing with catchers. Yeah, just sample out of the catchers.
Great, thanks. And now we have a question from Hui Lam Chim. Do you have any suggestions on how we decide on which soil tests to be used, i.e. Olsen, Melich, and Bray, test facilities?
Yeah, it's not a difficult one. Because I don't see, the truth is that I don't really know a lot about different soil tests because in New Zealand, we're such an agricultural country that and a lot of agricultural soil testing is done. And so the soil tests that we do here very much reflect the requirements or the circumstances here in New Zealand. So, just almost taken as said that because there's so much soil testing done here, been so much looking at the best ways to do it in our circumstance, that the tests that the labs do here are the ones that are best suited to us here in New Zealand with our climate and our soil types. So I really don't, I don't have a lot of information about what's going to be better for different circumstances. But you can find this information. If you look up Melich 3, you'll be able to find where it developed. It was developed, I can't remember, a certain part of the United States where there's certain types of soils and so forth. And so you can sort of find that information that'll sort of point you for if you're in a high rainfall climate with acidic soils, that such and such soil testing method is likely to be the better one. Yeah.
I guess that's sort of the challenge in certain countries. They don't have such developed domestic testing. So the benchmarks are needed. So you need to do some research and try and get as close to your growing conditions as possible within that context. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the main thing I'd say is that if you pick a lab and it's a good idea to it's easy for us to say this because this is pretty simple here. You pick a lab and you keep going to the same lab. So you keep getting the same extractions so that you can compare over time. It's not a great idea to just chop and change between labs because then you really can't make comparisons because everything's a little bit different.
Bendra from India has another question. What is the ideal time to collect a tissue sample?
Well, I guess normally what's going to happen is that you'll go out and mow the greens in the morning would be normal, and then after that. But what I would suggest if you're tissue testing to send to the lab, it'd be better if the clippings are dry. So a dry cut in the afternoon would be better. And just another thing about tissue samples, they can deteriorate, obviously. So it's a good idea to, like, if you're going to courier them, that might take 2 or 3 days. So couriering them on Friday is probably not a good idea. It's better to do them maybe early in the week so you can get them straight onto a courier to get them to the lab as quickly as possible. So yeah, I'd say when it's dry, and think about how quickly you're going to be able to get them to the lab. Now, because they will start to deteriorate quite quickly in hot conditions. But another thing is, we get some tissue samples back from overseas, coming in from overseas. Now we know they're going to deteriorate fatally if we just send them normally. So what happens with them? We get them to air dry them, which is a relatively simple process. You can dry them down sufficiently so that they will then not deteriorate, and then the time it takes to ship them is not a problem. So that's something to bear in mind. If you're in a situation where you do need to send them, say, overseas, you can dry them and then you take the sort of deterioration of the samples out of it.
Thanks. We have a question from Ross in Hong Kong. Alex, would it be fair to say that if you follow mostly a foliar spoon feeding program, minimal granular, that you will have more than likely see nutrient deficiencies in the soil?
Well, I guess the thing about just foliar or liquid applications is that you would be potentially applying not very much nutrient at all. No, I don't necessarily think that's true, because if you're using an analysis, maybe take the occasional soil test, but then do tissue tests to confirm that what you've got is okay, and then that you've got a well-designed fertiliser program. I didn't get on to talking about fertiliser programs. I could do that if I get asked back again at some stage. You could, so if your fertiliser program is properly designed in terms of identifying how much nitrogen you need annually and how much phosphorus you need annually and so forth, and it's like I say, properly designed fertiliser program, and you're applying that through your nutrient applications, then you will be able to sort of maintain suitable levels of nutrient in the soil. But the only thing I'd say about that is bear in mind that a lot of time in high sand content, low CEC situations, the amount of nutrient you have stored in the soil is really neither here nor there. It's so little, it's almost of little, well, I shouldn't say little benefit, but it's actually a very small amount in the context of the total amount you're going to apply annually. And what you're doing, and what you guys need to know that you're doing, because you're used to it, but you're kind of running hydroponic systems where you're applying all the nutrient the plant needs, and you get very good at it, and you take it for granted that you're very good at it. So I wouldn't necessarily be too worried about that, because if you're maintaining good turf through foliar applications or liquid applications, over a long period of time, it's just telling you that what you're doing is fine. And the fact that there isn't much nutrient in the soil doesn't really matter. We know that, they're low nutrient storage situations.
And a follow-up from Ross, what are your thoughts on foliar versus granular fertilizer programs in heavy rainfall locations such as Asia, where we can get 2 to 3 meters of rain a year?
Yeah, well, I think you get into sort of, like in some circumstances you can use granulars that are soluble, and especially in New Zealand where you've got sort of some areas of low rainfall and high soil greens, and you use granulars and you put them on 2 or 3 times a year, and it works remarkably well. But yeah, when you're in very high rainfall climates, I think you either have to rely a lot on slow release fertilizers, so that there's some form of holding nutrient, not just trying to get it to store in the soil, but actually in the fertilizer itself. So it's slowly released from the fertilizer. So slow release fertilizers, or very much based on very frequent liquid applications where you're once again spoon feeding all the time, because you can't store a lot in the root zone. It washes out very quickly under those high rainfall situations.
We have a question from Henry back in Sarawak. Can foliar feed substitutes conventional fertilizer methods via root uptakes? Can foliar feed substitute conventional fertilizer methods via root uptakes? That way we can ignore factors such as the CEC, the pH, etc. I think I got the question right.
Yeah, well, I think in many ways, that's kind of what you do in very high rainfall situations and very low CEC soils. You kind of almost, like I say, run the system hydroponically. You're not able to store a lot of nutrient in the root zone, so you just have to feed it, very frequently, and you get, like I say, you get good at that. Just one thing though, I would also talk about, I think people need to be careful about the terms foliar and liquid. I think the two get confused, and to me, a foliar application, a true foliar application, is a specially formulated fertilizer that's applied, obviously in liquid form, to the leaf of the plant at a low water rate, so that it stays on the leaf and is absorbed via the leaf. So that's what a true foliar fertilizer does, and as opposed to liquid applications, which is where the water is used as a carrier. Essentially, you dissolve your fertilizer and you spray it on, and it goes into the root. The main method of uptake is via the roots. And I think this is the key thing to talk about or think about. Most liquid applications are going to be taken up through the root. They're not designed to be foliar applications. And the fact that it's dissolved and put on in a liquid form, it's just really convenient in terms of being able to put small amounts on frequently. That's what it allows you to do. You can put on small amounts extremely evenly because it's dissolved, and you spray it across the whole area. So mainly when you're putting on liquids, they are going to be taken up through the roots. They'll wash in and they'll be taken up through the roots. And true foliars are really not that common. And in fact, to me, I'm not, overly obsessed by foliars. And to me, a lot of the time you're using a foliar is when you're in trouble. Let's say you've got, I don't know, your roots have completely rotted out and they've pretty much got a dysfunctional root system. Your best bet then is to try and get nutrient into the plant by putting it on the leaf, and hopefully it can take it in through the leaf, because it can't take it up through the roots because of damage. So yeah, like I said, I think foliars are often a sort of a thing when you're in a bit of trouble.
Thanks. We have a question from Rob in Hong Kong. Tissue testing is nice, but it's a snapshot of the particular week, or even a couple of days on the greens pertaining to golf. Wouldn't soil testing give a more representative view of how both turf maintenance and the overall management program needs to be structured?
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but I kind of don't agree with that, because I think if you look at a root zone that maybe has a CEC of 2 or 3, it sort of stores so little nutrient that, and it can change so fast, that I don't feel that in a lot of circumstances that the soil test information is really that useful or has any great longevity about it. Because, you think about it, if you take a soil test and then you get a really wet month, wetter than the normal wet month, a lot of that nutrient's just going to have leached out. So yeah, I think tissue testing on a regular basis probably tells you more about what's happening than soil testing on a regular basis. The caveat I would put on that, though, is that if you're dealing with high CEC situations, like on, say, fairways on soils and so forth, yeah, I mean, in that case, the soil testing can be, much more useful. The reason why is because the soil is able to hold a lot of nutrient, and the soil test will tell you how much nutrient is held in the soil in that situation.
And I think we have a final question. A lot of questions today, Alex, which is great. From Farhana in Malaysia. She asks, what is the optimum period for the new fertilizing program can reflect to the soil test result?
Okay, so if I understand the question, you're saying how quickly you should react to a soil test result. Maybe that's what you're trying to say. I hope I'm interpreting that correctly.
I think that's it. Yeah.
If I look at a situation like, where you've got soil with high CEC and as opposed to a sand low CEC, if I've got soil with high CEC and an ability to store a lot of nutrient, if I've got a soil test result, it's going to remain, relevant for quite a while until, where's the nutrient going to go? It's, a little bit might get extracted by the plant. It won't reach out. So, I would say that I could, it's not urgent to start straight away, because you're going to end up with a plan that says, well, I need to put maybe a large amount of phosphorus on, a large amount of potassium, and I can plan when I'm going to do that during the course of the year. So it sort of depends a bit on the situation. But if you're in a high rainfall, low CEC situation, you get a soil test result back, what I'd be saying about that is, you want to be reacting to that very quickly, basically. Because if you look at a soil test, the time that in that situation, in a high rainfall, low CEC situation, the time that the information is most accurate and most valuable is as soon as possible or for a short period after the test. So yeah, I'd be saying in that case, you need to react, well, you might as well, or you should be trying to react to it and act on it very quickly. In a situation with high CEC, it doesn't matter so much. You've got more time on your hands, because things won't change as quickly in the soil in that case.
Thank you, Alex. And Farhana, if the questions, you have more questions, so we'll have a follow-up email with everything, with Alex's ability to ask Alex questions separately to get more depth on that. So I think that's it, Alex. I mean, a lot of great questions, and I really appreciate your time. I know I think we had plans about a year ago to actually have you out in Thailand, Taiwan, and Philippines, right? That was a year ago, with almost these dates. So we would love to have you out and meet you in person in the future, and we still plan to do that. So thank you
I
very
certainly
much.
hope that that'll happen at some stage in the future. I mean, like a lot of things in the last 12 months, they didn't happen. So yeah, it's life.
We'll resume normal service as soon as we can. So we welcome seeing you at that time. So again, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Really greatly appreciated.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And just to follow up for everybody attendees, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. I know you all have time compressed schedules. I just would like you to know that in the future, we'll continue to have our webinars. Next week on Thursday, the March 11th at 4 p.m. we'll be joined by Mark Bates, the Director of Golf and Operations at Laguna National Golf and Country Club. He'll be talking about operating your golf shop is right for your golf club. So more of a club management role, but good for everybody in turf management to learn as well. And we, with the support of all our members, we are happy to be able to host other turfgrass peers of Alex, like Stephen Tucker from the Four Seasons Resort in Orlando, an equipment manager expert. Dr. John Sodahan from the University of Tennessee is also on our list to confirm, and Dr. Kevin Kenworthy from the University of Florida as well on various different turf topics. So again, this is just the start of a fantastic 2021 schedule, and just please continue to check the website. And if you're not on our mailing list, please come back to me directly. I will make sure you receive the information. So that is it for now. I'd like to wish you all a great rest of the week and a fantastic weekend. Thank you very much. All right, signing off. Thank you.